Hello, space friends. Captain Snuggles here, back in X4 Foundations to demystify low-attention combat. This will be my second major test of post 8.0 AI combat performance, following up my high-attention cost-effectiveness test. High attention is much more exciting, but if we're being objective, low attention is more important. It's X4's primary simulation mode, covering more than 99% of the galaxy at any given time. The vast majority of the game's combat takes place in low attention, but we actually don't know much about how it works. Even its basic mechanics have always been widely misunderstood because it's basically a black box. We can't observe exactly what ships are doing or why they're doing it, and we don't know the formulas that are being used to determine the outcomes. We can only observe the inputs and outputs. So that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it in a way that allows us to predict what outputs we'll get from a given set of inputs, meaning how well different combinations of ships, weapons, and loadouts can be expected to perform. I won't be able to fully demystify low-attention combat, but will at least come away with a good understanding of the basic mechanics and general trends. Like with my high-attention test, I'll be focusing on ship-to-ship combat. Station demolition will be a separate test in a separate video. For this test and this video, I'm going to start out with an overview of what we do know, clear up some common misconceptions, lay some basic groundwork, and then dive into the details of my experiment. Before we start, let me say that my initial hypothesis was that this test would provide some redemption for the direct combat capital ships. Destroyers and battleships performed relatively poorly in the high-attention test due to their weak weaponry, poor mobility, large hitboxes, and slow-thinking AI. I expected those weaknesses to be mitigated in low attention. Let's see if I was right. First, the basic groundwork. Low attention is X4's official name for the set of mechanics applied to the area of space that isn't being directly observed, and high attention is the opposite. They're superficially similar to the in-sector and out-of-sector designations from X3, but they actually have a lot of major differences. High attention refers to a 50 to 150 kilometer radius bubble centered on the camera. Think of it as the area within which you can see objects rendered in space, and then project that area out into a sphere around the camera. That's your high attention bubble. Low attention is everything else. So, high attention is not strictly in sector, and low attention is not strictly out of sector. In terms of game mechanics, out-of-sector combat in X3 was widely considered to be just a raw damage calculation, and a lot of X4 players believe that low-attention combat is either exactly the same thing or a lightly modified version of the same thing. However, that isn't the case. X4's low-attention combat uses an extremely minimalist spatial simulation that takes into account ships' orientation, distance, size, and speed, alongside more than a dozen different modifiers that are meant to approximate the physical constraints of combat without actually simulating all those physics. Bear in mind that the game's XML files tell us the modifiers themselves, but not the formulas that the modifiers feed into. The formulas are the black box, the modifiers are just part of the inputs, but we can still learn a few things from them. I'll give you a few of the highlights here. First off, main weapons can only fire in the direction the ship is facing, and have several modifiers applied to reduce their damage. However, although their damage is reduced, their accuracy is greatly increased, and they do not generate heat. They also have a very generous firing arc that applies to all weapons, even fixed weapons. So, on average, all main weapons fare reasonably well in low attention compared to high, and this set of modifiers especially benefits weapons with high damage, low accuracy, high heat generation, and/or fixed mounts. Turrets, meanwhile, can fire in any direction. However, they only have a 30% chance to fire during each firing cycle, and they have more damage reduction modifiers than main weapons, and they have an additional set of modifiers applied to reduce their accuracy based on the target's size and speed. Additionally, turret commands don't work in low attention. Regardless of what they're set to attack, they'll always just spread their damage across a semi-random subset of the hostiles in range. If you think that might raise some red flags for my hypothesis, you might be right. Hold that thought, we'll come back to it later. Missiles have their own set of modifiers, which have been gradually improved over the years. That said, the modifiers alone are hard to interpret because their XML metadata references parts of the combat formulas that we can't access, so we'll just have to test them and see. Again, although we know all those modifiers, we don't know whether that's all the variables being used or what the formulas are that use them, so although that gives us some insight, I didn't want to make any assumptions based purely on those numbers. I only want to draw conclusions from quantitative testing. Thankfully, there's already been some testing done that I can build off of. Immy is another YouTuber who does quantitative X4 testing, and I used some of his older videos to help me choose my test loadouts, and he's also working on a new series comparing the effectiveness of weapons in high and low attention, which is really helpful because it means I don't have to test every single weapon. I just have to test enough to enable us to make comparisons between Immy's dataset and mine. I also had a dataset sent to me by Kajar. Most low attention testing is not up to date, but Kajar's test was done recently, and it covered turret performance in a handful of combat scenarios, which again helped me narrow down my loadouts for this experiment. Now, let's talk about my methods. Even with that previous testing to build on, I still had a lot of ground to cover. To cover all that unknown ground, I used a two-stage protocol that started by exploring the general trends in combat effectiveness between different ship types, weapon systems, etc., then used those general trends to identify a set of ships to compete in the second stage, which was essentially a repeat of my high-attention test. The first stage, exploring general trends, was the biggest, most important, and most complex part of this test. The test was simple. Just take down a single Xenon defense fleet consisting of 1 I, 2 Ks, and 30 escorts. For each fleet I deployed, I recorded the total value, the losses it incurred, the ammo it expended, and the time it spent in combat. I used those stats to determine two metrics: raw effectiveness and cost effectiveness. Those were my dependent variables. My independent variables were ship size, ship archetype, weapon system, medium turrets if applicable, and large turrets if applicable. Ship size is self-explanatory: small, medium, large, extra large. Ship archetype was either defensive or offensive. For each size class except extra large, I picked one ship that exemplifies a tanky defensive design philosophy and one ship that exemplifies a fast, aggressive design philosophy. Similarly, with the weapon and turret variables, I selected weapons and turrets that were representative of a general category of weapon: light, medium, heavy, and missile, with a couple of others thrown in for good measure. Adding that all together, I ended up with this set of ships and loadouts. Small, Callus for the defensive archetype, Morea for the offensive archetype. Medium, Osprey Sentinel defensive, Dragon Raider offensive. Large, Phoenix Sentinel defensive, Odysseus E offensive. Extra large, the Asgard, with no archetype because there are no other mass-producible direct combat extra-large ships to compare it to. Weapon systems: Pulse, Bolt, Plasma, Shard, all Mark II, as well as heavy smart missiles and of course the capital ship main batteries. Medium turrets: pulse, bolt, plasma, flak, and tracking with heavy smart missiles. Large turrets: beam, pulse, plasma, and tracking with heavy smart missiles. With a couple of small exceptions, I tested all those ships with all applicable combinations of that equipment, keeping the number of ships deployed constant within each size class while allowing the fleet's total value to fluctuate by up to 30%, generally centered on the 150 million credit price point. Like with the high attention test, I make no claim that any of these ships or loadouts are the best option for normal gameplay, but they are the best options for testing what I wanted to test within the price bracket that I set. As you can see, this is an extremely complex dataset using 48 different combinations of ships and weapons. If I'd been working on my own, I would have had to replicate the runs and do this stupid test 144 times, and I still wouldn't have come out with very good stats. Thankfully, I was not working on my own. I had help from Dr. Elliot Howley, who holds a PhD in cognitive neuroscience and is therefore about 50 times better at statistics than me. He has helped me out before, and I'm very grateful he agreed to do so again. If you're on Twitter and you want to see what a cognitive neuroscientist gets up to, check him out at the handle ElioHow. I did the in-game testing to produce the dataset, and he analyzed it using a series of linear regressions to determine how raw effectiveness and cost effectiveness varied with ship size, archetype, weapon systems, and turrets. Here are the results. Ship size was enormously influential on both raw effectiveness and cost effectiveness. The correlation is extremely strong, with a near zero p-value, and the adjusted R-squared tells us that size explains a whopping 50% of the variation in ship effectiveness across the whole dataset. Medium ships were most effective, with the fastest completion times by an overwhelming margin, as well as extremely low loss rates. Second was small ships, with slower times and marginally higher losses. The Asgard came in a distant third, with extremely slow completion times and several runs that it couldn't complete at all because it couldn't effectively damage the target subcapitals. That said, it never suffered a single loss in any run, which put it way above our fourth place contender. The destroyers had very slow completion times and higher losses than any other size class, putting them decisively in last place. So, huge differences between size classes. I should mention that this reflects not just the hulls and their innate characteristics, but also the characteristics of the size of equipment that goes on them. The combination of medium ships and medium equipment is better than the combination of small ships and small equipment, etc. Compared to size, weapon type had a much smaller impact on effectiveness, but still a noticeable one. Here's the full set of results. However, main batteries are intrinsically tied to the hull they're on, which is already accounted for in the size variable, and additionally I only tested shard batteries on small ships. If you strip away those two variables and look just at the weapons that I tested across all the subcapital ships, here's what you're left with. The clearly visible trend is that heavier weapons have higher raw effectiveness, although Bolt drops off in cost effectiveness due to their price. That said, the correlation between weapon type and raw effectiveness was fairly weak and only explained 11% of variation. The correlation was stronger with cost effectiveness. The takeaway here is that heavier weapons are generally more effective, but their impact on a ship's overall effectiveness is a lot less than the impact of the size variable, which again represents not just the size of the ship, but also the size of the equipment that gets attached to it. For example, there's a bigger difference between medium plasma and small plasma than there is between medium plasma and medium pulse. And again, this is only for the primary weapons on subcapital ships. Turrets are extremely different. When you look at all the ships that had medium turrets, the type of medium turret was not a statistically significant predictor of combat performance. However, when we break it down further, we see some interesting trends. Looking just at medium-sized ships, your choice of medium turret has absolutely no consistent impact on their low attention performance. Any impact it might have is completely overshadowed by the massive impact of the size class and weapon choice. But when you look at just capital ships, suddenly your choice of medium turret becomes extremely important alongside the large turrets. The combination of turrets explains roughly 70% of the variation in capital ship effectiveness. With the medium turrets, overall, the order is that missile is best, followed by flak, pulse, bolt, and finally plasma. Practically speaking, though, they fall into two groups. The high performers are missile, flak, and pulse, and the low performers are bolt and plasma. Then with large turrets, the overall order is that missile is best, followed by beam, pulse, and then plasma. Missile and beam are comparable and are very much the high performers. Plasma is definitively the low performer, and pulse occupies the middle ground. So, broadly speaking, missiles are a very powerful option for both turrets and main weapons, but other than that, turrets have opposite trends compared to main weapons, with lighter turrets generally performing better than heavier ones. Last up, archetype. This is a simple one. I was surprised to see that archetype is not a statistically significant predictor of low attention combat effectiveness. That doesn't mean that offensive ship designs are never better than defensive ones, or vice versa, but in general, across all size classes, there was no consistent trend of offensive or defensive archetypes being superior. That's all of the main results for the first stage, but I did do a quick little side test at the same time. I mentioned back in the weapons section that I only tested shard batteries on fighters. Well, I also ran the shard and bolt fighter tests in high attention, specifically to get a quick glimpse of how well low attention combat captures the high attention variation within a group of weapons, in this case the medium damage general purpose weapons. In high attention, shard had a 36% faster completion time and a 67% lower loss rate compared to bolt, and in low attention, shard had a 7% faster completion time and a 29% lower loss rate compared to bolt. Obviously that wasn't a comprehensive test, but it does suggest that there is some alignment between high attention and low attention when comparing weapons of the same general category. There you go. Those are all the results for the first stage of my experiment. Before we talk about stage 2, I want to talk about what these initial results mean. Again, they were meant to explore general trends in low attention combat effectiveness by using combinations of ships and equipment that were representative of broader groups of ships and equipment. You'll recall that my hypothesis was that capital ships would be redeemed here after their poor performance in high attention, and you can see that my hypothesis is already in serious trouble. There's an enormous gap between subcapital effectiveness and capital effectiveness. You can see that just from this graph, but actually the gap is even bigger than it looks here. The scoring system I used doesn't have a one-to-one relationship with in-game performance. The average capital run scored about half as well as the average subcapital run, which translates to capitals being more than 6 times slower and suffering more than 12 times the losses on average. So yeah, when I say there is an enormous gap between capitals and subcapitals, I mean there is an enormous gap between capitals and subcapitals. There's also a noticeable performance gap between small and medium ships, and a wide gap between large and extra large ships. Let's talk about why that is. First off, there's the size of the ship. Not the size class, the actual size of the ship's model. ships smaller than 75 meters receive scaling damage reduction, with a maximum of 80% reduction at a size of 0 meters. This only applies to incoming damage from turrets, not from main weapons. This is a huge benefit for fighters, and also a relative benefit for main weapons over turrets. Then there's the ship's speed. Ships with a speed of 100 meters per second or lower get a 10% damage reduction. Ships with a speed of 600 meters per second or higher get a 70% damage reduction. Ships between those speeds get scaling benefits between 10 and 70%. Again, this only applies to turret damage, not main weapon damage. This is a big benefit for subcapitals, and again, for main weapons as opposed to turrets. Similar to speed, ships have a chance to dodge incoming damage based on their agility. The XML files don't provide any info on what agility means in this context, but obviously this favors smaller ships. Additionally, there's a note in the XML that states that individual weapon systems factor in target maneuverability when determining their damage output. So it seems like there are additional agility-based defensive modifiers that are applied on a case-by-case basis based on the source of incoming damage, which again is not very specific, but clearly still favors smaller ships. I'm not positive, but I think that the way this is handled for medium-sized weapons is one of the big factors in the excellent performance of medium ships. Medium weapons have phenomenal base stats, so their damage output probably isn't significantly reduced by target maneuverability, and thanks to low tension's generous firing arcs, they aren't severely limited by the need to turn the ship and rotate the gimbal like they are in high attention. Add all that up, and I think that the low attention damage application mechanics highly favor medium-sized main weapons over any other weapon system, which in turn helps medium-sized ships to be favored over any other size class. Moving on, we have the various damage modifiers. If you multiply out all the relevant modifiers, the average main weapon deals about 85% of its listed DPS, whereas the average turret only deals about 20% of its listed DPS. And that's before you consider the defensive multipliers from the target's size, speed, and agility, all of which impact turrets more heavily than main weapons. And then you have to consider that turret commands don't work in low attention, which forces them to divide their damage among the available targets, including ones they can't effectively hit, which reduces their applied DPS even further. I did the math, and in this testing scenario, large plasma turrets dealt less than 1% of their listed DPS against capital ships, and less than 1/10 of 1% to subcapital targets. The gameplay implication there is that since your turrets are forced to shoot everything, the best turrets will be the ones that are capable of hitting everything, with missiles coming out on top because they're the only type of turret that can both hit everything and deal decent damage. All these damage and accuracy modifiers also negate the big weakness of medium ships in high attention, which is that they're easily focused down by turrets. That's very much not the case in low attention, so chalk up another win for medium ships. Alright, so obviously everything we just covered is very unfavorable for capital ships, and just as icing on the cake, their main batteries can't seem to do anything against subcapital targets, probably due to the case-by-case defensive modifiers from agility. Not that that doesn't make sense, but it's still more bad news for capitals. And then, of course, there's the minor detail that subcapital weapons just deal way more base damage than either turrets or capital main batteries when you consider the scales at which they're typically deployed. Capital ships do get a few bonuses. They get 10% damage reduction versus turrets, and there's a 2% chance for additional damage reduction against any weapon when shots get absorbed by their surface modules, and they can all use drones. As always, repair drones have a delay of 2 to 3 minutes between the time the hull gets damaged and the time they start repairing, If your ship survives that long, they can add a lot to your active tanking ability. Defense drones are weird in low attention. They stay docked while dealing about 23% of their normal damage. One drone is destroyed for every 200,000 damage taken by the mothership, and they provide the mothership with a 0.3% damage reduction per drone, up to a maximum of 50% with 167 defense drones. So, that's nice. Since frigates can also use drones, I'd call that a qualified win for capitals, and the 12% damage reduction is a definite win for capitals. The Asgard in particular gets one more huge benefit, which is that its main weapon is functionally gimbaled in low attention, same as all other weapons, which massively improves its damage application relative to high attention. That one mechanic is enough to boost the Asgard to the absolute top of the pecking order for low attention capital ships, although it's still less effective than subcapitals due to all the other factors we've just discussed. The last thing to note here is that the Xenon are subject to all these same mechanics. Xenon capital ships suffer heavily from all the turret penalties, although just anecdotally, I do think graviton turrets are still one of the best capital-sized weapon systems in low attention, so I think subcapitals are actually where the Xenon really fall short. Based on my results, it's safe to say that Xenon subcapitals have extremely weak low attention damage output compared to other factions, which in turn means that this test setup likely represents the best case scenario for my capital ships. A lot of the capital loadouts I tested weren't able to effectively damage the Xenon subcapitals, but the Xenon subcapitals also couldn't effectively damage my capitals, so it was basically a stalemate. If I'd been up against a faction that uses weapons that actually deal damage in low attention, then my capitals still wouldn't have been able to damage the targets, but the targets would have been able to damage my capitals, which is obviously a much worse combat scenario for my ships. So, there we go. That's my analysis of the Stage 1 results. We've identified a lot of reasons why subcapitals outperform capitals, and a few reasons for the relative performance of medium versus small, and extra large versus large. The trends seem pretty clear here, but I wanted to collect just a little bit more information, and I also wanted to be able to draw a more direct comparison to my high attention test results, which brings us to Stage 2. I used the Stage 1 results to theorycraft the best possible loadout for each size class while sticking with the same ships and equipment, and I used those loadouts to repeat my entire high attention test in low attention. Those loadouts would theoretically have been Missile Maria, Missile Flak Dragon Raider, All-Missile Odysseus, and an All-Missile Asgard. However, I wasn't confident the Missile Maria could carry enough payload for the whole test, so I switched to Plasma Marias instead. Same for the Dragon Raider, so I switched it over to Plasma Flak, and I added an additional ship, Missile Flak Ospreys. The test was to travel through 2 systems and defeat 3 fleets, an H and its escorts, and 2 IKK fleets and their escorts. I started with a total fleet value of 150 million credits, then if a fleet succeeded, I reduced the value to 75 million and tried again. For fleets that failed at 150 million, I bumped their value up to 225 million credits and tried again. For each fleet, I recorded the winning value, losses, ammo expenditure, and completion time, and I used those stats to determine the fleet's cost-effectiveness score and its performance tier. Here are those results. The Dragon Raider did exceptionally well, winning at the 75 million credit price point with an absurdly fast completion time and 0 losses in either of its 2 runs, placing it in S tier. The Maria was second best, winning at the 75 million price point with decent completion time and acceptable losses, placing it in A tier. Then came the Osprey, which won at the 150 million credit price point, where it posted fairly quick completion times, moderate ammo use, and fairly low losses, placing it in B tier. Then there's the Asgard, which also won at the 150 million price point, with slow completion times, high ammo use, and 0 losses, which all averaged out to B tier. And lastly, there's the Odysseus, which could only win at the full 225 million credit price point, and only then with slow completion times, moderate ammo use, and heavy losses, placing it in C tier. Thinking back to everything we learned in Stage 1, I'd say the only real surprise was the mediocre performance of the Osprey. I really thought it would make it into A tier, but at the 75 million price point, it couldn't kill the eyes fast enough to avoid taking some attrition, which had compounding effects over time, and ultimately kicked it down to B tier. Other than that, there were no big surprises, but still I cannot overemphasize how absolutely dominant the Dragon was. There is absolutely no comparison between it and any other contender. I also can't overemphasize how badly the Odysseus performed. I really considered moving it to D tier, but I've generally reserved D tier for ships that couldn't complete the test at all, so the Odysseus stays in C tier purely on a technicality. The last analysis I performed was to compare the Stage 2 low attention results to the results I saw in my high attention test. Basically, these 5 fleets were the best loadouts I could come up with in low attention, so I compared each of them to the top performing high attention fleets and their respective size classes to see which classes perform better in which simulation type. Destroyers perform worse in low attention than they do in high attention, mainly due to their abysmal damage output. The Asgard performs much better in low attention, thanks to the improved damage application on its main battery and the reduced damage of its opponents, which means that it's pretty much mathematically incapable of dying. Fighters perform very slightly worse in low attention, and medium ships perform much better, especially the fast, aggressive style of medium ships. Overall, the performance ranking is as follows: low attention medium ships, high attention fighters, low attention fighters, high attention medium ships, low attention Asgard, high attention destroyers, high attention Asgard, low attention destroyers. Obviously, there's variation within each of those categories, and there are more types of combat ship than just those, but those are the comparisons I was able to make with the test results I had, and I think they paint a pretty clear picture. In terms of gameplay implications, first off, there's no practical reason to ever use anything for ship-to-ship combat other than offensive-style medium ships in low attention. The Plasma Flak Dragon Raider in low attention had an average completion time of 13 minutes and an average upkeep of 0 credits. The next best fleet, which was the No Such Thing high attention fighter fleet, had an average time of 22 minutes and an average upkeep of 8.4 million. The difference is absurd. It even outcompetes personal piloting, by far. Obviously, doing everything in low attention would be pretty boring, but practically speaking, that's the optimal choice, and fast, high DPS medium ships are the optimal way to do it. Meanwhile, fighters look like the optimal choice for a fleet that can fight effectively in both high attention and low attention. The only issue is that their effective weapons differ between the two simulation types, so you'll want to bring either a mix of light and heavy weapons, or uniform loadouts of general purpose weapons like tau accelerators, or just a whole bunch of missiles and some way to replenish them. The Asgard is still not even remotely competitive with subcapitals, but we're starting to see a niche for it. I know some people really hate the idea of losing any ships at all, and this test identified 2 options for that in low attention: offensive-style medium ships and the Asgard. The Asgard is objectively the way worse option for all ship-to-ship combat applications, but it is still an option. And of course, we still have station demolition to consider in a future test. Speaking of which, station demolition is the last hope for destroyers. They have absolutely no place in low-attention ship-to-ship combat, and they're pretty dang unimpressive in high attention combat. A lot of the issues come down to their base damage, damage application, and damage mitigation, all of which are bad across both simulation modes, but for different reasons. They're never going to be good at ship-to-ship combat without some major overhauls to multiple game mechanics, so let's just hope they knock it out of the park when it comes to station demolition. All that being said, you should use whatever ships make you happy. Don't let me stop you. But if you're trying to achieve your in-game goals efficiently and effectively, hopefully this test has provided you with some helpful information. Same goes for my high attention combat test, so if you haven't seen that yet, make sure to check it out. I'll also have a couple more tests coming out in the next few months that will hopefully round out this set of resources for the community. Final note. In my high attention test, I concluded that that set of gameplay mechanics was functionally in its final form, and that I therefore wouldn't test it any further. I do not feel the same way about low attention. In fact, based on my testing and on some of the notes Egosoft has left in the XML files, I don't think the low attention combat mechanics are anywhere near finished, so they may still get some major changes. If they do, I might run some follow-up tests, and if I do, I'll make sure to link them in the description or a pinned comment. Before I go, I want to extend one more thank you to Emmy for his helpful content, Kajar for his advice and assistance, and of course to Dr. Elliot Howley for all the extensive mathematical support he provided. And as always, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you'll tune in next time, and until then, this is Captain Snuggles, signing off.